Let's get started on the land. Has anyone in the class spent time in Israel, Palestine? No. Notice I use both words for it. Yes, Israel, Palestine, because there is a nation of Israel. Palestine refers, of course, to the Palestinian people. Also, it is a name that goes back to the time of the Romans. So it was known as, that was the name of the province in ancient Roman times. So, and obviously Israel refers to Israelites, the Jewish people and so on. Okay, so I've had the privilege of being there a number of times. I can say a little bit about this. When you think of Israel, what's your mental picture? Do you have one of like what the land looks like?
I have a feeling this is going to be kind of off, but generally kind of like deserty.
Deserty. Is that what? Yeah, I'm getting nods. Okay. Is that what most people? Yeah. There's more variation, kind of. You're thinking kind of deserty, but there's quite a bit of variation. For instance, like one surprise, if you go up in the north, all the way up here to Mount Hermon. I haven't been on top of Mount Hermon. I've seen it from a distance. That is permanently snow covered. So think of like, I don't know, like Pikes Peak in Colorado, you know, one of these permafrost. You wouldn't think, well, in a desert land. So, and Mount Hermon, actually, the snow melt flows down, and this provides much of the water for this region. So that's an area where it's cool. It's much cooler, obviously, because you have snow on top of that mountain. Now, as you go further south, you get to the Dead Sea. And this area around here, this is like a moonscape. If you travel in California, some of you, okay, think of Death Valley. In some ways, if you want to find an analogy, I would use California, but you'd have to maybe blend in a little bit of northern and southern California. I think the area around in the south around Jerusalem, it reminds me in some ways of kind of Los Angeles, San Diego. But as you go further north, you have the terrain changing somewhat. It looks maybe a little bit more like Northern California in that you have more trees. It's less arid, less rocky. But there's significant variation across the area. Anything else come to mind when you think about the land itself? What about the economy in ancient times? Obviously, there's a new economy today. Israel has the most, after the US, has the most number of technological startup corporations. It's very much a high-tech center, and there's a whole variety of different industries. But what about in ancient times? Nicholas, were you going to say something?
I can't, but I can. I'd imagine just mainly because that's kind of what we see in the Bible, a lot of fishermen, and it's along this long coast with a couple different seas.
Okay, yeah, sorry, you were lit up there. There was maybe there was some sound there, so that's why I called on you. I wasn't trying to call you out and put you on the spot.
Yeah,
so, and where do the fish where are the fish caught?
The sea.
Okay, we have the Dead Sea, the Sea of Galilee, and the Mediterranean. I suppose we have the Jordan River too. Anybody know? Okay, the Sea of Galilee, which is fresh water. That's fresh water, and that is really, even today, Chinneret is the other name for it. I had Galilee fish every morning when I was there. I was staying at the Ein Gev Holiday Village, which is just over on the east side of Sea of Galilee. So Sea of Galilee is this is, we don't have a scale here. It's number of miles across. Of course, in the gospel accounts, there's a storm. The storm is not in the Mediterranean. The storm is on the Sea of Galilee, and there are storms that will blow in. This is a mountainous region up here. During the Israeli-Syria war, on the mountains, the cannons or people took artillery right up on this mountainside, and they fired down onto the villages, the fishing villages that are there today around the Sea of Galilee. So if you ever hear of, like, if you follow global politics, the Golan Heights, Golan Heights. That refers to this region right here that's claimed by Syria. But Israel said, if we don't claim the Golan Heights, our land is indefensible. So Israel claimed that after the Six-Day War in 1967. So anyway, it's a hot topic politically, but it's a hotly contested area because these mountains are needed to, but there's quite a bit of fishing going on here. And then right here is where the Jordan River flows out of the Sea of Galilee. This is the traditional spot of Jesus' baptism. And this is where many Christian pilgrims come today to get dunked another time, second or third or fourth time, I suppose, for some. So this is a river valley, it runs down. This is part of the Great Rift Valley. If you continue this further beyond, it goes all the way across East Africa. It's like a rift in the surface of the earth. If we had a global map, you'd see that. But it comes down here. The Dead Sea, the water flows into the Dead Sea. What flows out of the Dead Sea? Trick question, nothing. Waters flow in, nothing flows out. So what kind of water do we have in there? Saline. Think of, if you've been to Salt Lake City, you've seen like the Great Salt Lake, it's about equivalent salinity. In fact, you don't want to get in it will just absolutely sting your eyes, burn your eyes really badly. But if you're careful, you can get in there and it feels really strange because you don't really sink. The water is so saline that it buoys you up. And this is the desert region. When you hear about the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is a community that lived out in this, again, this is like the moonscape. This is like really, really, almost you're not on planet Earth because there's nothing green at all right along this west side. This is Jordan, the land of Jordan on the other side, but Kingdom of Jordan, but on this side of the river. Actually, this is Moses, who according to the Bible was not allowed to go into the promised land, but could only see it from a distance. The tradition is that he went up on top of one of the mountains here and he looked across and God showed him the promised land, but he didn't. Israel came across westward, across the Jordan River to enter and then to begin to fight the Canaanite tribes in order to take possession of the land. But the Dead Sea is this saline. It's the salts are said to be have the natural effect of creating smoother and softer skin. So in what is one of the great marketing ploys, the local residents will simply scoop up some of that Dead Sea salt and basically sell it, like scoop it into a container and then sell it for $5 or $10 or $15 on the global market. And I tried it. I rubbed some of the mud combined with salt, and yes, my skin did feel a little bit softer for at least a couple of days afterwards. So anyway, supposedly has this cosmetic property. Okay, Jericho, very, very ancient city. This is one of the most ancient cities in areas that may go back 8,000 years. So we're thinking like even the early period of the pharaohs, the early pharaohs, like very, very ancient. This is famous in the Bible for what?
The walls of Jericho.
The walls came a-tumbling down. Yes. So the story in Scripture is that the children of Israel under Joshua surrounded Jericho, and when they blew the trumpet, the walls came down, and then they invaded. There are some the archaeologists debate. There's some evidence of conquest. It's not clear whether that was exactly at the same time. This is Jerusalem, which of course is the ancient center of the southern kingdom. Notice Judah and Israel. Why are these differentiated on this map? This gets into history, right? History of the Israelites. Okay, so there was a united kingdom, but that lasted only a few kings, right? The first king, the biblical king, was Saul, then David was the second, Solomon. Then the stories of Solomon's son Rehoboam was not a very wise leader, and he basically was oppressive toward the people, and they wanted relief from these having burdens of forced labor on construction projects. And it said the northern kingdoms rebelled, and the southern kingdoms remained loyal to David's descendants. So there was a split that occurred, and so the 10 northern tribes became known as the Kingdom of Israel. Judah became the southern kingdom, and the northern kingdom were conquered by the Assyrians, who were far off to the east, came into this area, took them into exile, and in many ways they drifted away from Jewish practice. Many of them intermarried with the Assyrians. They lost their distinctive, they assimilated would be the word. They assimilated, they blended into the way of life of the Gentiles. The kingdom of Judah also went into exile, not at the same time, but went to Babylon to the east, came back, and preserved more of a distinct identity. So at the time the Romans had conquered, beginning in the 1st century BCE, it's known as Judea. And Judea includes some of Israelite descent, some of Judean descent. There's no longer a separation between the two. Let's see what else. Okay, this is the Mediterranean, of course. These are lowland areas. And notice this is labeled Philistia. Now, in the scripture, the Israelites were told in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, that they were to take over all this land. They were to occupy it. It said in the Philistines, though, it said the people who lived along the land had iron chariots. And so they had particular weaponry that they could not use in this hilly area, but was particularly effective on the plains. And so it said the Israelites were not able to drive out the Philistines and to take full occupation. Of course, this today would be the Gaza Strip. But in ancient times, there was a distinction between the Israelites and Philistines. They were in conflict with one another. They were related ultimately to the Philistines, or Phoenicians, to the Carthaginians who settled along the coast of North Africa. And so there was political distinction in ancient times, as there is today, between this coastal region and the inland region. What of Megiddo? That may not ring a bell, but have you heard the word Armageddon? Okay, Armageddon is just a variation. It's the same place name. Armageddon or Megiddo is the place where, according to one of the Hebrew Bible prophecies, the end of the world will come. And the armies will all gather and fight one another. And actually, there's a story, I don't know if it's true or not, but Napoleon, when he was in the Holy Land, he saw the great plain around Megiddo, and he made the comment, all the armies in the world could march around in this plain. It's big enough for that. And so the biblical concept basically, if interpreted literally, would be that that's actually going to happen. This place, there's an Israeli Air Force base there. It's near, Megiddo is near Mount Carmel. It's visible from there. Mount Carmel is where Elijah had his confrontation in the Hebrew Bible with the prophets of Baal, who practiced human sacrifice and other practices that were contrary to Israelite religion. And so in the biblical account, there was a confrontation between the two, and Elijah prevailed in Mount Carmel. There's also a group of Catholic nuns and male religious and nuns called Carmelites, and this is where they began to settle in the Middle Ages, and some then went to Spain and other countries later after the time of the Crusades. There's so much history. You know, when I was in Jerusalem, our guide said that there were 18 different destructions and rebuildings of Jerusalem. And so you look at one point, this could go back thousands of years, be the, pre-Christian era. And then you look at another area, this was part of a building is built by the Crusaders, and then something else. There were pockmarks from the 1948 war, in which Israel is declared to be a state. So there are all these different layers of civilization, and it makes even a trip to Europe seem like, Europe seems like a Johnny-come-lately. You think, well, there's so much history here. I'm in London, I'm in Paris. There's no comparison with the city of Jerusalem. When I was with one of the tour guides, we broke away for a while, and we ended up just bumming around the old city, climbing all around, unsupervised. And so we end up at the Russian cathedral, and that was wild because the Russian priests were there, these men with these long beards, and they were swinging their incense centers. They were chanting Church Slavonic, which is the ancient Russian language, which isn't even used anymore. It'd be like someone speaking Chaucerian English or something. And they they didn't even acknowledge it. We walked in because we just pushed the door open, and there were all these icons, painted on the inside. And then we went up and we climbed around the wall, and I look on the wall over, and there's a plaque. It said, on this site, Suleiman, the forces of Suleiman defeated the Crusaders at the taking of the city of Jerusalem in the year 1100 and something. So it's like, we were at the very site where the city that had been conquered and taken for Christian possession away from Muslims was reconquered and taken back for Islamic possession. So tremendous amount of history. Any questions about the land itself? Okay, well, let's fill out the picture a little bit more. So there's, as I said, the weather is variable. The climate varies between the subtropical and the arid zone. Egypt is more uniformly arid. Of course, there's the water of the Nile that irrigates the Nile Valley, but beyond that, it's quite an arid area. Whereas Israel is more varied. The map that I have here doesn't really show you the scale, but Israel is a small country in relation to, the coastal plain is only about 115 miles in length. This whole strip of land from north to south. And Israel was always surrounded by powerful neighbors, Egypt to the south, Syria up to the north, with its capital in Damascus, and then further to the east, not on the map, Babylon and the Babylonian Empire, the Assyrian Empire. It's hard for us if we've grown up in the U.S. to understand what it's like to be in a small country surrounded by powerful neighbors, because we, by contrast, are a large and powerful nation with neighbors that have been weak to us, and then we have oceans on both sides. But if you've grown up in a country like Belgium, if you know the political and military history of Europe, you know that Belgium is where all the armies, Napoleon's armies marched, Hitler's armies marched back and forth, the Allied armies, World War I, World War II. So think Belgium, think a nation that is a crossroads. Israel is at the juncture. Of one hand, it's part of the landmass of Asia, but of course it is adjoining the Mediterranean, so that there's sea access, someone who wants to come from the sea, and then it is connected with Sinai and with the African continent. And so it's at a juncture. There's one reference in the Old Testament that speaks of the land of Israel as the belly button or navel of the world. And it is still, even today, it's at a critical juncture in terms of the world geography. So the temperature varies, of course, as the rainfall does. Up in the north, there's up to 44 inches of rain per year in Upper Galilee. So you see quite a bit of, it's not exactly lush, it's not a rainforest, but there's significant vegetation wherever you look, and trees. Around the Dead Sea area, the rainfall is less than an inch per year, so extremely arid. And the mean average annual temperature in the coastal areas is around 68 to 70 degrees. That's Fahrenheit. Eilat in the far south, the temperature may rise up to 120 degrees in August. So, Eilat's not quite on the map here, so a little bit off the map. So there's variation in plant and animal life. Originally, there were evergreen forests, but these disappeared even in ancient times because of the centuries of cultivation, and goat and animal herding also destroyed the original forests. The forests were cleared. So it's mostly a wild scrub vegetation. There's quite a bit of animal life in the land. There are indigenous mammals, include wild cats, wild boars, gazelles, jackals, hyenas, badgers, and weasels. There are reptiles, including the Agamon gecko lizard. We saw lots of geckos when I was there, so think of gecko, I suppose, right? I think. They did a good job planning that in my mind. The viper, among the birds, the partridge, the cuckoo, the grouse, the desert lark. There are various kinds of fish and insects as well. And sometimes there are invasions of desert locusts that occur. And this gives some background coloring to the statement in Mark's gospel. It says Jesus was in the wilderness and was with the wild beasts. That's chapter 1, verse 13 in the gospel of Mark. The New Testament doesn't really provide any description of the land. We really have a description of, when we're reading about Jesus' life, we're not getting a lot of description regarding the land in which he lived. There are some references to divisions of the land: Galilee up to the north, Perea, and Judea to the south. Samaria is intervening between Galilee and Judea. And we talked briefly in class about the Samaritans as a group that had of Jewish descent, but that had adopted at least some practices that were contrary to Jewish law, and therefore were not looked favorably upon by the more orthodox, more straight-laced Jews who were centered in Jerusalem. And this is why it's significant. In John chapter 4, Jesus is talking to a woman, and it says the disciples came back and they were surprised he was talking to a woman, because in the custom of the time, a man would not approach an unrelated woman in public and begin talking to her. That would be like odd. And then she's not only a woman, she is a Samaritan woman. And that really meant that Jesus was sort of breaking the cultural standards of the time. And then it turns out that she is living out of wedlock with a man, and she's already been married multiple times. And Jesus, rather than blaming her for that, he says, oh, yes, that's right. Yes, you've had these husbands. And so he shows that he has prophetic knowledge of her, but it's a very non-judgmental approach. It's very interesting. But the disciples are trying to wrap this brain around, so why is he talking to this woman? And she ends up believing in Jesus and then going and proclaiming there's something about him to the other people of the village. And so she ends up kind of as becoming an evangelist. But the Samaritans and the Jews did not see eye to eye, did not get along very well at this time. So Nazareth is a well-known name. It's mentioned as the name of Jesus' upbringing, even though he is born in Bethlehem. So on the map here, Bethlehem is just south of Jerusalem. So if you're looking south from Jerusalem, you can't quite see Bethlehem, but you see there's a ridge of hills. That's where the Garden of Gethsemane is located, and there's a ridge along there just on that side. But Bethlehem is quite close by. Nazareth is further to the north. Let's see, I don't think it's on the map here. No, it's not on the map. But Bethlehem and Jerusalem are just a few miles apart. Bethlehem is the ancestral city of none other than King David. And so during the registration, the census that was commanded by Caesar Augustus, all the families from Israel had to go back and register themselves at their natal places. It's hard for us to understand. I don't even know how we would do this in America. Go back to the place where your ancestors were from. Well, most of us we are quite scattered in our family backgrounds. But in those days, generally people would, you would marry the person who lived 3 houses down from you in the little village that you grew up in. I remember visiting contemporary India and being in rural India, and it was kind of like that, where, many people had never been I met people in India, this is rural India, of course, but many who had never been 3 or 4 miles from where they were born. They lived their whole life within a smaller geographic. So you point to a hill. Have you ever been on the other side of the hill? No. And so it's hard for us to understand. But this is a time when there was much less mobility. That, by the way, that also sheds a different light on Jesus as a wandering teacher and the disciples living this wandering life with him. That was very countercultural at the time, because it's considered a tragedy to be separated from your family and the village and the people that you knew, and to have to go to another place. Only in times of war or exile or some calamity were people forced to move around. So Jesus unlike the typical rabbi, did not park himself in one place, but he traveled around. So there are some mysteries in the Gospels. One is that there are some large cities. There is a city of Tiberias. Now that's not mentioned, but that's up along this west side of the Sea of Galilee. And then Sepphoris is also nearby. Sepphoris and Tiberias are the kind of large scale cities, and they are not even mentioned in the New Testament Gospels. It'd be like, let's say Jesus lived his entire life within the state of Missouri, was traveling around to small towns, and there was not a single reference to Kansas City or to St. Louis. That would strike you as odd, right? If you knew something about Missouri, you say, well, wait a second, did he never go to the city? So we don't really have an answer to that, but it does seem that, and then if you think Jerusalem is like Chicago, you say, well, why did Jesus go to Chicago and end his life there, but not go to Kansas City or St. Louis? So we don't really have a direct answer to that, but it seems that Jesus, his life, his ministry, his teaching was focused on these smaller villages rather than the larger urban context that was close by in Galilee. And then, of course, the city of Jerusalem plays a role as well. Jesus seems to be able to move with ease between the different regions of Palestine. And what the scholars say is that in the period during Jesus' life, the tensions between Jews and Gentiles were increasing. It was becoming maybe a little bit more difficult for Jews and Gentiles to relate to one another, which gives a different spin on Jesus' life. But even after Jesus' death, in the 40s and the 50s, leading up to the time of the Jewish revolt or the Jewish war, Gentile-Jewish relations really got bad, and there was social banditry. So there were bandits that were, and some of these people were in rebellion against the Roman authority. And so they were just going out and taking what they wanted. And so if you were a traveler on the road, and you remember the parable of the Good Samaritan we read in Luke? It says that the traveler was on the road between Jerusalem and Jericho. I've been on that road. That's like in the middle of nowhere. It's like driving across, I don't know if you've ever driven across Nevada. I don't mean Las Vegas. I mean, you get into like northern Nevada, this is where they want to put at Yucca Mountain, where they want to put the nuclear waste there. This is like nothing. Again, it's like a moonscape. There's like nothing around. So that's what that area is like. So to be a traveler, kind of unprotected in some of these regions, traveling around was possible during Jesus' life, but it became more difficult later on. Okay, so I mentioned people who were rebelling or wanting to rebel against Rome. Why would people want to rebel against Rome? Maybe the answer is obvious, maybe it's not obvious. Feel free to respond by chat. Reasons for rebellion against Rome.
There's always just sort of the aspect that the country was being occupied by Romans.
Okay, simply because Rome is a foreign power? Is that what you think, Nicholas?
Kind of reason enough.
Okay. If a foreign nation came over speaking another language, there might, in Missouri, in St. Louis, that might be reason enough. Can you think of anything else? Okay, Tara says, privately, I guess it's okay to share, the high tax. Can you elaborate any more, Tara?
So the Romans taxed the Jewish people. In the reading, it said up to 35%, and that led a lot of the Jewish people to not be able to pay. So they would have to choose to pay the Jewish tax or the Roman tax. And a lot of the times that they would only pay the Jewish or the Roman tax because they had to.
Now, yes, imagine, very good, excellent, great point. If you are involved in subsistence agriculture, and one of the reasons we have evidence that this was subsistence agriculture is at one point when they didn't sow the field to given year, they said that the people who lived on the land would not be able to pay the tax next year, meaning they didn't have any surplus left over. It's not like they had storehouses they were just filling with the extra food, extra produce that they produced each year. It was pretty much hand to mouth. And if Rome is claiming 35%, now what does Jewish law prescribe? You given to God of what you produce? Anyone know? Some Christians follow the same principle. If you're giving how much, if you're going to give a certain fraction? You ever heard of the tithe? 10%? No? Tithing? Okay, some Christians, some churches today preach it. It's more of a Protestant than a Catholic thing, I'd say. But there are churches that I went to a congregation once where if you gave 10% of your money, you got to come forward. And if you didn't, you had to sit in the pew. I thought, well, that's really putting the pressure on. You know, and they also printed the amounts of money in the back of the only church I went to that was quite like that. But in any case, you have 10%, the tithe. One day of the week, 1 out of 7, the Sabbath day, which was Saturday, the day to be honored by not working. So 1 out of 7 to show that all 7 days are from God, but you honor him one day. Similarly, the tithe, the 10%, was a sign that all 9/10, well, the 10/10 all came from God. And so, and it was obviously, if Rome is taking 35% and you're barely getting by, Rome is the one that has the power to enforce their tax at sword point, right? And the Jewish law is more of a matter of conscience. And so some of the people that you're encountering during the life of Jesus that are considered bad Jews, like not really faithful Jews, they're not giving the tithes. They're rendering to Rome what Rome is demanding, but they think, hey, I can't go beyond 35%. And because tax farmers, the tax collectors could take as much, they weren't really, Rome, the policy of Rome was as long as a tax collector would deliver to them their cut, like let's say 35%, the tax collector could take more than that. He could walk through your house, oh, wow, this is a beautiful vase. Yeah, we'll take this. You have any silverware here? You know, and just sort of take as much as you want and then he would skim and take the tax collector. This is why the tax collectors were hated. That he would take what he wanted for himself and then give what he was required to Rome. So there were some very strong reasons, financial incentives to fight against Rome. Now, if you picture yourself living in this time, would you choose to fight against the Roman Empire? From what you know of the Romans? I'm seeing no's in the classroom for those online. No? Why not? You say, get out of here, Romans. We don't want you here.
They'd be like fighting against the U.S.
Be like fighting against the U.S. today. Well, Rome had a reputation that had developed over centuries, and it didn't mean that Rome won every single battle. But I'm thinking of the episode that happened during the Spartacus slave revolt. This would have been before the time of Jesus, just slightly before. The gladiators who fought were actually trained fighters, so they were a formidable fighting force that the Romans were defeated at a couple of battles. And then Crassus, what did he do? He used the Roman policy of decimation. You've heard of being decimated? What does that literally mean? You know? They what?
Like they wiped out.
They wiped it. Well, yeah, that's how we use it today. It actually has a very specific meaning. To decimate the soldiers, that was the most terrifying thing for any army. He lined up all the soldiers and they count off 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Every 10th soldier had to step out of the line, and the 9 soldiers before him had to kill him. So 1 out of every 10 soldiers randomly was killed. He says, okay, we're going to decimate, and if you lose another battle, we're going to decimate again. And guess what? They won the next battle against the Spartacus gladiator fighters. So I'm just saying that Rome had a particular ruthlessness. You see it in the punishment of crucifixion. Because the crucifixion it was like state terrorism. It was basically saying, if you get on the wrong side of Rome, this is what will happen to you. And you think it was all terrorism. I mean, the thing is that the Romans also believed they had a legal system as well. It wasn't, at least if you were a citizen. If you're not a citizen, that's another thing. But if you're a Roman citizen, you actually couldn't be condemned without a trial. And so as barbarous as some of this, as cruel as some of this sounds, it was actually an advancement above a kind of sheer like warlordism where everyone, takes whatever he wants, and you have, people, bands of men roaming through the soldiers. Rome actually was a more orderly society in certain respects, but they were known for their ruthlessness when you went against Rome. So think about this for a second. So if you were going to fight against Rome, how would you go about doing it? Unconventional, yes. Such as, like, what would an unconventional way of fighting against Rome be?
Guerrilla tactics using terrain.
Like in Afghanistan, yes, using the terrain against the very first guerrilla war in history was the Maccabean revolt. And this was when, now this is pre-Roman, but it gives you some of the idea of the tactics of guerrilla warfare. The Seleucid monarchs who were preceded the Romans, they put a pagan image up in the Jerusalem temple. And there was this massive turn of the Jewish people to defend their religion, to defend their God. And so the Maccabeans, it means literally hammer, the hammer men. What they did is that they retreated into the caves. They knew the topography, they knew the landscape, and they would wait for the Romans to come like marching through a narrow valley, right? And then they would like roll boulders on them, attack them from above, and then they would vanish, they would disappear. The same kind of tactics that were used so effectively by the Viet Cong against the US soldiers who were in Vietnam, Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. People who knew the land were able to attack and then withdraw, attack and withdraw. You wouldn't go line all your soldiers up in open field of battle against the Romans. That would be suicide because of the thing. So there were, and we'll get to this in a moment, but we talked about the Zealots, the one that wanted to overthrow Roman rule. There were a group of them known as the Sicarii, or the dagger men. And so they would have weapons on themselves, and they would hide in the crowd, and then they would just, in a crowded area, they would come and they would stab the Roman soldiers secretly, and then they would just disappear into the crowd. And so it was asymmetrical warfare. It was non-conventional in order to, because there's only way you could go against the Romans and have any hope of doing that. Okay, so the Roman rule is the reality of the day. What's interesting, surprising maybe in the Gospels, when you think of this backdrop, the fact that Jesus, we've already read in the Gospel of Luke, had positive things to say about a Roman centurion, that he had not found such faith among his own Jewish disciples as among the Roman centurion. You see that, when you understand the background, then that's like really like, wow, that's like really surprising. Jesus did this. This is not a message. Jesus' message is not for Jews only. Even though he's focused on the people of Israel, there is a universal dimension, and there's, just as it's surprising that Jesus is speaking positive words, not to the Pharisee who was supposed to the woman who cried at his feet, who was one of those kind of women, almost certainly a prostitute. That's surprising, the way that Jesus responded to the Romans. John the Baptist, even when he's preaching to the Roman soldiers, they said, "What shall we do?" Because they're stirred in hearing John's message about God and his coming judgment. And he said, "Be content with your wages. Do not take things, unjustly from other people." He doesn't tell them, stop being a Roman soldier. And there's a famous tract by Martin Luther called "Whether Soldiers Too Can Be Saved." And he uses that verse and says it's basically a defense for the notion of a kind of a civil, there's a place for a civil order with police, with army, and so on. So based upon that text. So the things that are surprising in terms of the attitude toward even the Roman soldiers who were the front line really of the Roman presence and Roman occupation. Jesus' ministry seems to be largely confined to the Jewish population. If you look in Matthew chapter 10, verses 5 and 6, and Matthew 15, verse 24, he tells his own, when he sends them out, he says, "Do not go among the Gentiles," he said, "but go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, the Gospel of Mark does show that Jesus among the people of Gerasa. And Gerasa was right up on this eastern bank of the Sea of Galilee. I was in a van driving along here many years ago, and there's one place where the bank is where there's a steep cliff right before the water begins. And they said, the tour guide said, this is where the pigs came down and drowned in the water. They said it's the only place where the bank was steep, because it says when Jesus cast the demons out of the man in the region of the Gerasenes, not kerosene, Gerasene, Gerasa, or the Gerasenes, or there's another translation, Gadarene. It's the same word, but it says the demon tended the pigs, and they went down the steep bank and they drowned. So that's at least the traditional site is along here. And there was a lot of Gentile and Jewish population intermingling in that area. The fact that there are pigs that are being raised commercially in that area at the time, that obviously is a sign that people are not particularly concerned about Jewish law, because they wouldn't be doing that otherwise. Okay, so who's really in charge? Let's talk a little bit about the political system, political power in Galilee. Who's in charge? Well, Rome, ultimately, right? But are there other names that you remember in terms of the exercise of power in the Holy Land at this time? Rome is a long ways away, right? So who's actually wielding the power in the land? Well, let me change the question. When Jesus gets in trouble with the ruling powers, he's not called before Caesar, right? He's not sent off to Rome. Who calls Jesus to account? Gospel of Luke, which you've read already.
Jewish leaders.
Okay, yeah. So Jewish. So what Jewish leader or body? Okay, Benjamin says online, he says Pontius Pilate. Yeah, so what was Benjamin, can you tell me what was Pontius Pilate's official role or title?
Was he called was he like a governor or something like that?
Yeah, essentially it's a governor. It's procurator was the official title. Procurator was like a regional government. So he's ultimately accountable to Caesar at this time. Yeah.
Is he like a Roman liaison in the area?
Well, he's accountable. And Tiberius was the Caesar at this time. So Tiberius Caesar, he would have been like a regional governor. He would have had less independence than the U.S. governor has, as we've seen during the COVID era. Local governors, actually, the president of the U.S. doesn't decide everything. Local governors can have their own area of jurisdiction. That wasn't the case. Rome was a governmental system where everything went back ultimately to Caesar. And so if the local procurator did not please Caesar, he would be recalled and replaced, and he might pay the price, right? He might end up exiled or imprisoned or executed if he failed to follow Caesar's will. But think about the Jewish authority. What kind of Jewish authority still existed under the Roman umbrella? Okay, the chief priests, the Jewish temple is extremely important. The priests are important. there are some scholars that think that the Jewish temple was the most impressive religious building in the entire Roman world, that there was nothing comparable to it anywhere else. It was and so when the disciples are saying, what beautiful stones, there's the past, and Jesus said, not one stone will be left upon another. It's a shocking thing to them, because this was the glory of Israel. And so because the kingdom of Judah has been conquered by Rome, there's no independent king as such. Like there's the line of David does not exist, but they still are allowed to have their religious elite. And these high priestly families had basically made their deal with Rome that if you will keep us as high priests, you know, you can kind of see a kind of a live and let live, an understanding, let's say, between the Roman authorities and the high priestly authorities. Or they say, look, you know, they sit across the table and say, we have a common interest here. We want peace. We don't want the soldiers at war with our people. We don't want our people fighting against your soldiers. So, you know, let us continue, our families continue to control the high priesthood, and we will try to keep the people pacified, keep them in line, but you need to have our back. So it was, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And these were particularly from the sect known as the Sadducees. I'll say a bit more about that later. So, but the high priestly families, Jesus, they do play a part, of course, in toward the end of Jesus' life. But remember, maybe it's sort of a detail that maybe has fallen by the wayside. But remember the name Herod as well. The Romans, to a significant extent, they engaged in what was called indirect rule, where when they conquered a territory, they wouldn't necessarily eliminate all the local elite, but they would allow them to be in place, allow people to keep their own customs. As long as people were paying the Roman tax, they were acknowledging Roman authority in many areas, not so much in Palestine, but elsewhere. They would set up temples to Caesar Augustus, they would set up temples to the Roman gods, and you would have to sacrifice at those temples to show that you were a good Roman. The Jews wouldn't do that. And so they finally learned the lesson. They tried to put Caligula, who was that crazy emperor who, kind of out of his mind guy, he wanted to put an image of himself in the Jerusalem temple. And he found that all the Jewish leaders said, we will all die rather than let that happen. He realized he couldn't do that. But most places, the Romans tried to co-opt the local societies by implementing at least some element of the emperor worship. You burn incense towards Caesar every now and then to show that you're loyal. It's like saying the Pledge of Allegiance, kind of loyalty oath. But what they did was to keep the high priests in power. But then they also let Herod, who was partially of Jewish descent, to reign, and so he ultimately was under Pontius Pilate, but he was allowed to make some decisions, had some degree of leeway. Herod the Great is succeeded by Herod Antipas, and Herod Antipas is the one who actually was in power at the time that Jesus was put on trial, and Jesus is sent to Herod, and he's sent to Pilate, and Herod's great interest was seeing a miracle performed in front of him. When Jesus sent him, he says he'd been wanting to see a miracle, and Jesus didn't perform like a trained circus animal, performing on cue. So he was sent back to Pilate, and says Pilate and Herod became friends with one another that day. They'd previously been in tension they had not seen eye to eye because they didn't agree over issues of governance. So it's interesting, when Jesus is being condemned, they're coming together as friends. Herod was allowed 200 talents in personal income from his territory, significant, and this was collected as a land tax that was equivalent, estimated to 440,000 bushels of wheat each year, almost 500,000 bushels of wheat each year. That was what Herod was allowed. And there was also tribute to be paid to Rome. That is Herod's own tribute. We don't know exactly how much that would have been. Herod could impose special levies for building projects. Herod had the power to force peasants to live in his new city, a form of compulsory labor that was prevalent throughout the empire. And so there are lots of hardships that these people faced day by day. Another hardship is that Herod the Great had sent part of his army to be billeted for the winter in Galilee. And that was one of the things that the people would rather pay taxes, and the billeting is where the army would just say, hey, our soldiers are going to stay in your house. And of course they could be, there was essentially, I mean, they could be disruptive. They could be guilty of sexual assault. All kinds of terrible things could happen while the soldiers are billeted. This is actually in the U.S. Constitution. I don't know if you realize that, the billeting of soldiers was one of the objections that was made in the Declaration of Independence, I believe. Maybe it's both Declaration of Independence and Constitution. There's a reference to the billeting of soldiers, because that was one of the practices when the U.S. colonies were under George III. So there was a threat that loomed over the peasants of the region. This question of the soldier. In the Sermon on the Mount, there's a passage where it said, if someone shall force you to go with you 1 mile, go with him 2. Now, that was a very surprising statement for anyone with a strong sense of political resistance in them, because what he's talking about there is a forced march where the soldiers would have a heavy pack on their back, and they just grab some peasant boy, maybe a teenager, and say, hey, you're gonna go a mile, you're gonna carry this pack for me the next mile. And so when Jesus says, if they force you to go 1 mile, go with them 2, he's basically saying to submit yourself even to the humiliating treatment that the Romans regularly meted out to the people of the land. I'd say we've talked about the tax situation already, severe impact of that, maybe up as high as 50%. Let's see, we mentioned the banditry also going on during the 60s in the land. One of the things, okay, a little bit about the culture. There was more cultural diversity in the land of Israel or Palestine, the province of Palestine, than has often been recognized. In fact, some scholars think that Jesus probably knew enough Greek to be able to converse in that language if he had so chosen during his itinerant ministry. We don't have evidence of that directly from the Gospels, but people said that even to have a fishing business at that time, to be able to buy and sell materials, one would have had to have some working knowledge of Greek, because Greek was the common language throughout the Roman Empire. You think, what about Latin? Yeah, Latin was the language of educated Romans everywhere. But prior to Roman conquest, the Greeks, of course, under Alexander the Great and his successors, they conquered much of the Mediterranean world. So Greek was actually more widely used at that time. So so there was Greek culture as well as Latin culture and Aramaic culture, the language being used then. So we have a diversity of different languages. We have Galilee as a center for import and export, as well as general trade. There was an interconnected system of waterways, a road system that connected the whole Galilean region to further up to Syria, up to the north, to Lebanon, to eastern regions, to the south, into Egypt. So the region where Jesus grew up was really a cultural crossroads with a lot of mixing of different ideas. It's not an isolated, out of the way area. One of the busiest routes was called the Via Maris. It stretched all the way from Damascus to the Mediterranean. And Nazareth was situated right along that route. Capernaum, which is a town often mentioned, it's located on the Sea of Galilee, had about 12,000 to 15,000 people, and it was culturally more diverse than Nazareth. If you ever get to Capernaum, you'll get to see Peter's house. And this is a house that is excavated that is now thought, on the basis of some fairly reliable archaeological investigation, to have been a house that actually was somehow associated with the historic Peter the Apostle. Matthew, who was also known as Levi, who was a tax collector in Capernaum, he would have probably had to have used Greek to converse with the local taxpayers and officials. And so, so we find cultural diversity: Gentile, Jewish, Samaritan, Greek, Latin, Aramaic as the spoken language of the Jewish people of the land. Jewish religion is also diverse at this point. It isn't simply one thing. The Romans had conquered Palestine in the year 63 BC, before the Christian era began. And this whole region from 63 BCE to 70 CE, that we're bracketing the time of the beginning of the Roman conquest of Palestine to the conclusion of the Roman War against the Jewish people, when the Jewish people revolted. This is sometimes called the first age of diversity. That's the term that Jacob Neusner uses. There were significant internal debates over what it meant to be Jewish. And so there isn't one Judaism, there are competing Judaisms. And they had certain common interests. They were concerned with Torah, the written law of God, with the temple, with ceremonial law, with purity. But there were diverse ideas that existed among them. And really, this first age of diversity, after the time of Jesus and the end of the Roman war, we enter into a more of an age of the rabbinic period, where there's a great deal of commonality among Jews, all scattered in many places throughout the world, but those following rabbinical Judaism have a great deal in common. And then it's in the 20th century, or the modern era, I guess 19th and 20th century, we have a second age of diversity, as Neusner said. So what's the diversity? Well, we could start with Josephus, his comment trying to explain to Gentiles in his day, who is a Jew, what do Jews believe and practice? He said, well, there are four major groups among us. And he named them as, first of all, the Pharisees, probably the best known from reading the Gospels, best known religious group among the Jews. He said, secondly, the Sadducees. The third group that he mentioned are the Essenes, Essenes. And then the fourth group were the Zealots. And so if you wanted to sort of translate this, you could say the Zealots represent a kind of a form of political Judaism, Judaism as a kingdom, a nation, and their focus was on the restoration of Jewish self-rule. So if you want to look in the 20th century, the anti-colonialists in Africa and Asia fighting against European colonizers, it would be kind of like the Zealots in their own society. That was their primary preoccupation. The Essenes, Essenes, are generally identified, that Josephus mentioned, with the finding in the 20th century of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We didn't know much about this group before we found the Dead Sea Scrolls. We had Josephus mention them. We knew they lived in the desert, that they wanted to keep them, so they thought that the leaders in the temple, the high priestly sect, were impure, and they wanted to follow a purer form of Judaism. If you want to find an analogy for that, think maybe of, the Amish, like in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, that kind of old-fashioned with the covered, the buggy, horse and buggy, and conservative clothing, almost a throwback, right? Because they wanted to avoid the technology of modern society, living aloof, a completely separate type of life. And then HBO, didn't they do this sort of Amish in the city or something like that? Yeah, it's like, what happens when the Amish, leave it to Hollywood to come up with something like that. But anyway, think of them almost as like an inward-looking group that wanted to practice a pure form of Judaism and thought, if we are faithful and obedient to God, then we will hasten the day of the Lord, the day when the Lord will come and will set everything straight. And so there was a kind of expectation that could be that God would bring deliverance, but they would have to be perfectly obedient. They were extremely strict. If you broke any of their rules when you're living out by the Dead Sea, like in this very, very desert, arid area, they would mulct you, M-U-L-C-T. To mulct meant that they took away your food and your drink, your water. You'd have no water. In fact, if you told a joke, I read one of the rules, if you made any attempt at humor, you'd get mulcted for a day. So imagine if Jerry Seinfeld ended up among the Essenes. He makes 3 jokes, he doesn't get water for 3 days, and man, you could perish in 3 days. So I don't think they were producing a lot of comedians out there. A very serious, sober-minded group, probably a small group. The larger group, maybe best known of all, was the Pharisees, and these were more of the mainstream of Jewish teachers. When you hear the word Pharisee in the English language, you probably think of what? What kind of association do you generally have? Someone, if you say, "Oh, you're being a Pharisee," what would that mean? In our contemporary usage.
Is it related to heresy at all?
Heresy? Well, not quite, because Pharisees believed in rules and followed rules, right? Pharisaical, maybe saying one thing, right, and doing another, being super strict officially, but maybe kind of cutting the corners. The point is that in later Christian culture, the Pharisees did not have a very good reputation because of the references to them as being nitpickers, or some said Jesus accused them of also laying laws down for other people, being very strict with other people, but not being strict with himself, maybe not living what they professed. But the point is that in the first century among the Jews, the Pharisees would have been highly respected. And so when Jesus is saying that there's something wrong there, I think that would have surprised his hearers. See, like in Matthew 23, if you read that passage, it's a very harsh series of statements about the Pharisees. He said, "You were like whitewashed tombs." He said, "Outwardly you're all white, but inwardly below you are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness." And so he's basically whitened sepulchres is the King James version of that. He's basically saying you're not what you appear to be at all. But we have to kind of get back behind that in a sense to really understand the Pharisees were religious scholars. They took seriously the commandments of the Torah, the written scripture. There's 613 different commandments, and they simply wanted to faithfully put them into practice in all areas of life. And so it says in the Hebrew Bible, remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. But the law doesn't tell you exactly how to keep it holy. Like, well, what can you do and not do? And the Pharisees wanted to really pin this down and make it specific. Like, for instance, when in their discussion, compiled in a later legal collection called the Mishnah, they said, "You shall not kindle a fire on the Sabbath day." Okay, now if you want to take this into the contemporary period, right? Kindling a fire. If you drive an automobile, are you kindling a fire? It's actually a legal question for Orthodox Jews. When you turn your key in the ignition, what do? You kindle a fire, right? Because it's a spark plug. So the strict Orthodox Jews to this day, they will not drive on Sabbath day. So you start getting into rules, and then you have rules under rules, right? In order to ensure that the basic rule is kept, you have to have a lot of subordinate rules. When I was staying at a motel next to the Dead Sea, on all day Saturday from like midnight, well, actually, I guess from sundown to sundown, because the Jewish day begins at sundown. From sundown Friday night to sundown Saturday night, the elevators, however many floors they went up and down, they stopped at every single floor. You couldn't just, if you're on the first floor and want to get to 13, you couldn't go right to 13. You'd have to wait and stop, and the door would open every interview. And the reason for that is to reach out and to push the button on the elevator would be considered, according to the strictest interpretation, a form of work. That would be working on the Sabbath day. You can't do that. So the strict application of Jewish law really kind of becomes encompassing, takes over all of life. The Mea She'arim is the so-called ultra-Orthodox. In Israel, these are called ultra-Orthodox people. How do you know it's an ultra-Orthodox person? Because you see the outward appearance. And if you go to Mea She'arim, this ultra-Orthodox area, the strictest group of Jews, the men are wearing fur hats, the same clothing that they wore in Eastern Europe before they went to the Holy Land. This is why I use the example of the Amish, like using some outdated or almost archaic kind of clothing. If you walk down the street as a Gentile, as I did, the men, they would not make eye contact with me. They would look away from me when I was there. There are strict rules about female garb. It's a kind of a double standard, because women are told, like, you can't have a short skirt, you can't have your arms uncovered. Actually, men are supposed to have their arms covered going into holy places in Jerusalem, particularly if you're going into an area where they're ultra-Orthodox. There's sort of interesting stories about a woman who didn't follow that rule, who supposedly was pelted with stones because she was regarded as inappropriate. I mean, not stoned to death, but she was shooed out of the area for not following. So the point is that the Pharisees were people that really sought strictly to follow all the rules and regulations. And as I mentioned, I think before, they ended up eating meals only with one another, because they weren't really completely sure about the average Jewish person, how strict they were. Were they going to follow all of the law, the dietary laws? What if they had had some unclean meat in one of their pots at a previous point? That would contaminate the pot. The Pharisee would destroy the pot. They would throw the pot out and never use it again, because they would not want to be contaminated. That's sometimes called fencing the Torah. If you want to follow the rule, then you need to make sure you stay clear away. Like if your rule is not to overeat at the local bakery because you love donuts, then the fencing the Torah would be like, I will never go within 3 blocks of a bakery shop. You see what I'm saying? Because if you don't go within 3 blocks, then you're not even going to see the donuts and not be tempted. So that's the way that the Pharisees thought. They thought about coming up with the strictest kind of rules that would get you into an area where you would never even run the risk of breaking the divine law. So, and then we haven't really talked about the Sadducees. The Sadducees are the hardest group to describe, because we actually don't have any of their writings. We don't have a writing that survived from ancient times reflecting the Sadducees' point of view. We know that they did not accept the idea of the resurrection from the dead as the Pharisees did, because it was contained within the Hebrew scripture. There may be some areas in which the Sadducees sort of compromised with Gentile thought, although that's not completely clear. But we do know that they were the group that were in control of the high priestly appointments within ancient Israel. So let me just pause there. I think we've gone over most of the. Oh, just briefly at the end, to say something about the Sanhedrin too, because we talked about authority in Israel. We mentioned Herod. The Sanhedrin was a Jewish council. It was like the parliament or Congress, so to speak, for the nation. At least the official number of members was supposed to be set at 70, because there's a reference to 70 elders of Israel who were appointed at the time of Moses and Joshua. And so that was at least the traditional number. The Sanhedrin were those that actually had the hearing, or you could call it trial. It's not clear whether it was really an official trial, it was more of a hearing that Jesus had to appear right after he was arrested, the first group that he came before. And so they acted as a judicial court. They were a political link to the Roman governor. They helped to uphold the public order. The high priest was said to preside over it. The high priest at the time of Jesus' death was Caiaphas. And they included the chief priests, the elders, scribes, and other leading citizens. If you've read the Gospels all through, you know that not everyone on the Sanhedrin agreed with the condemnation of Jesus. There was one figure that we know of, well, actually two that we know objected. One of them was Nicodemus. And it says Nicodemus did not agree with his condemnation. And so Nicodemus is involved in the burial of Jesus. The other is Joseph of Arimathea, of whom we know very, very little, although there are a lot of legends about him traveling to England later and all kinds of unusual legends about Joseph. All we know about Joseph of Arimathea is that he's said to have been a wealthy man, a member of the Sanhedrin, and he had a tomb that he had already prepared, presumably maybe for himself. And it said that he gathered up his courage after Jesus died on the cross, went in before Pilate and asked for the body. Now, that was a very courageous thing to do, because of course he could have drawn suspicion to himself, but apparently he had enough political and social capital that he could do that. And so he's the one who formally took possession of the body of Jesus, and then they laid him in the tomb that had already been prepared. So we have the Sanhedrin overwhelmingly decided thumbs down against Jesus for his condemnation, but it wasn't apparently a uniform decision. The Sanhedrin then was another of the bodies that existed at this time that had, like Herod, had some degree of independence and control, but ultimately was under Pilate made the final decision that Jesus was to die. Although if you read the gospel account, you know that Pilate felt that he was constrained by the people themselves who were crying out for Jesus to be crucified. So he took the bowl of water, washed his hands, kind of saying, "I'm not responsible for this. You people who are asking for his death are responsible instead." So, okay, well, that is plenty for today. We're at the end of our time. Bring any questions on any of the reading that you've done up to this point. Bring any questions from the gospel texts that we've read in Luke and in Mark. From the videos that you've seen, maybe we can have some time to talk about those. So anyway, this will be a kind of an omnibus session. We'll be catching up on Thursday and talking through everything we've done up to this point. And I'll say some more about the examination. The exam will have objective component. There'll be some essay component, but I'll give you maybe a hint as to what I might be asking on the essay. And I'll see you all on Thursday.